I reckon you've settled in, got your sweet tea poured, and are ready for a tale that hangs heavy like kudzu on a telephone pole. It's the kind of story that starts with a good man and ends with a question mark carved into his soul. This is the story of Pastor Noah, and the day the silence in his heart got so loud, the whole town could hear it. It all started the summer the magnolias stopped blooming, right after we laid his Sarah in the red clay down by the river bend. Sarah, bless her kind, gentle heart, had been the humming tune in the old Harmony Creek church, and when she went, the melody flat out died. Noah, he still lived in the parsonage, a dusty shadow walking through rooms that smelled of lavender and loss. He'd sit on the porch swing, rusty chains squeaking a rhythm that matched the ache in his chest, staring out at the gravel drive. He didn't read the good book, didn't talk to the Lord, and most importantly, he hadn't stepped behind that pulpit in 3 long silent months. The church door wasn't locked, mind you. Noah just didn't go in. The congregation, being the salt of the earth they were, whispered and brought over casseroles, tuna surprise, chicken pot pie, enough comfort food to choke a mule. But they knew a wound that deep couldn't be stitched up with cream of mushroom soup. They waited patiently for their shepherd to remember his flock, while the sun beat down, turning the usually green lawn of the churchyard a brittle, thirsty brown, mirroring the dryness of Noah's faith. Folks said the spirit had left Harmony Creek, and maybe they were right. Because what good is a church if the only sound coming out of it is the ticking clock? The town of Harmony Creek was drying up faster than a forgotten wishing well. The drought was wicked, the worst folks could recall since the great dust-up of '52. Every sunrise was a promise of more heat, and every sunset left the sky bruised and orange, like it was sorry for the day that had passed. The elders, especially old Deacon Silas, a man whose spine was straighter than the lines in a ledger, were growing restless. Silas had walked up to the parsonage porch 3 times now, each time finding Noah rocking, looking like a scarecrow in his own clothes. Silas wasn't a cruel man, but he understood the needs of the institution, and the church needed its offerings, its sermons, its sense of order. "Noah," Silas had said, his voice sandpaper and honey, "the people are hungry, not just for..." It was on a Tuesday, the hottest day of the whole sorry summer, when the silence was finally broken. The air was so thick with heat and stillness you could practically chew on it. Noah was sitting on the porch, nursing a glass of iced tea that had sweated itself into a puddle, when she walked up the drive. She was a sight, let me tell you. She wasn't wearing church clothes or even town clothes. Her dress was linen, the color of clean sand, and it looked like it had been worn by the wind more than a needle and thread. But the thing that made Noah pause, and the thing that had the few neighbors who were out on their porches stopping their rocking, was her feet. She was barefoot, walking right across the sharp gravel of the drive like she was gliding on cool moss. Her hair was the color of wheat straw after a light rain, and she carried nothing but a small, woven basket that looked like it held only air. She didn't look at the parsonage or Noah. She walked straight past him, her eyes fixed on the church building, which stood tall and mournful across the yard. Noah felt a prickle on the back of his neck, a feeling he hadn't known since Sarah's last breath. Attention. He watched her without moving, his iced tea forgotten. She didn't look like trouble, but she didn't look like a church lady either. She looked like a secret waiting to be told. Right there in the middle of a drought-stricken town where nothing ever happened unless it was planned on the church calendar. She stopped right at the foot of the church's granite steps, which were cracked and bleached from years of sun. Instead of going inside, which was the natural thing for a soul seeking a sanctuary, she turned off the main path and headed toward the overgrown memorial garden tucked behind the sanctuary. This garden, a small plot where Sarah had lovingly tended roses and irises, had turned into a tangled mess of weeds and dry, thorny remnants since her death. It was the one place Noah couldn't bring himself to look at, the true grave of his hope. The stranger, moving slow and deliberate, set down her small basket on a patch of dead grass. She knelt. She didn't start pulling weeds or trimming back the wild growth like a gardener would. Instead, she just ran her hands, gently, over the dusty, cracked soil. She looked like she was listening to it, or maybe apologizing. Noah crossed the yard slowly, the heat radiating up from the gravel and stinging his ankles. He stopped a respectful distance from the woman, who was now digging with her bare hands, not in the dirt, but around the edges of a particularly stubborn patch of browned-out English ivy. "My name is Noah," he corrected her, though he knew she hadn't asked. "I haven't been a pastor for a good while now." She finally stood up, wiping the dry clay from her palms onto the linen of her dress. She had eyes the color of pale river water, and they looked at him not with pity or judgment, but with a simple, quiet understanding that unsettled him more than any sermon or scolding. "I'm Lily," she said, "and a shepherd is still a shepherd, even when the sheep are scattered and the pasture is dry." She picked up a handful of the parched dirt and let it trickle through her fingers. "This soil remembers Sarah. It remembers the way she spoke to the roses. It remembers the promise of the seed." Noah felt a sharp, unexpected pain behind his ribs. She spoke of Sarah as if she'd known her, yet Sarah had been fiercely private about her garden, calling it her quiet communion. He was about to ask her who she was and how she knew his wife's habit when Lily reached into her small basket. She pulled out two things: a single, smooth, gray river stone and a small, shriveled seed, no bigger than a grain of rice, that looked far too old to hold any life. The seed was nearly black and dry, a relic from a forgotten harvest. Lily looked at the seed and then at Noah. "It just needs to be reminded of the water," she repeated, her gaze unflinching. "Sometimes, a long sleep feels like death, but it ain't the same thing." Noah felt the strange urge to shout at her, to tell her that some things were simply dead, gone, and dust, and that trying to wake them up was a fool's errand and a path to fresh heartbreak. He had tried to wake Sarah, hadn't he? He had shouted his prayers into the void until his throat was raw, and all he had received was the heavy, crushing silence of the world moving on. But Lily didn't give him the chance to argue. She walked over to the base of the granite steps, where a tiny, almost invisible crack snaked through the stone. She didn't use her hands this time. She took the gray river stone and placed it right over the crack, pushing it down just slightly, like she was holding the stone steps together with a wish. It was a pointless, almost childish gesture, but she looked satisfied. "There," she murmured, "a marker for where the journey begins again." Noah was left standing in the sweltering heat, staring at the small stone covering a crack, and wondering if the heat had finally baked the common sense right out of him. Why Curtains was not pleased. He wasn't a man who catoned to barefoot strangers putting stones on church property. He walked across town that evening, his leather shoes clicking sharply on the cracked asphalt, a sound of disapproval in every step. He found Noah inside the sanctuary for the first time in months. Noah wasn't praying. He was just sitting in the front pew, the one Sarah always used, running his thumb over the dark, polished wood. "Noah," Silas began, the word a heavy sigh. "The people are talking about the woman. She's strange, unsettling. She ain't been to a service, hasn't offered a dime in the plate, and she's out there fiddling with the dead rose bushes. The church is a place of order, son, not a circus." Noah looked up, and his eyes, usually dead and empty, held a tiny spark of something, maybe defiance. "She called herself Lily. She was talking about Sarah's garden." Silas sniffed. "A garden of dead things. That's what happens when you turn your back on your duties, Noah. And speaking of duties, we have a community meeting scheduled for Saturday. We need to discuss rain prayers. I expect you to be there. And that woman, she needs to know her place. This is a sanctuary, not a campsite." Silas left, leaving the door slightly ajar, letting the sticky evening air settle in. Noah didn't answer. He just kept tracing the grain of the wood, thinking that maybe a circus wasn't so bad. At least a circus had life, noise, and the honesty of a bold, bright lie. The next morning, Lily wasn't in the garden. She was on the dusty, abandoned playground behind the church, a place where the swings hung crooked and the metal slide was too hot to touch. Noah saw her from the parsonage window. She was sitting on the bottom of the rusty metal slide, using a piece of broken glass like a mirror to catch the sun. She wasn't just catching it. She was directing the light. She aimed the sharp, bright beam at the church's back wall, a wall that had always been cool and shaded. She moved the light slowly, tracing a small, bright line up and down the rough-hewn cedar siding. It was hypnotizing, a small, controlled fire of light on the darkest part of the building. Driven by that same raw curiosity, Noah walked outside. As he approached, he saw she was no longer just drawing lines. She was illuminating a spot where the cedar planks met, a seam that had been slowly widening over the years due to the relentless The small, specific detail of the broken downspout shattered some of the abstraction that had been holding Noah captive. His grief had been a grand, theological crisis. Lily brought it down to a broken pipe. He spent the rest of the day in the church shed, finding an old coil of copper wire and a pair of heavy-duty pliers. He worked on the downspout, sweating and cursing the rust, his muscles burning with the unfamiliar strain of honest labor. He wasn't praying, but he was fixing, and that felt like a kind of worship he could still manage. Lily stayed near, but not too near, in the memorial garden. She was still just stroking the soil and occasionally pulling up a long, dead vine. When he finally wrenched the downspout back into a rough alignment and secured the split with a tight, ugly wrapping of copper wire, he felt a strange, hollow sense of accomplishment. He walked back towards the garden, intending to tell Lily that the physical weeping of the church had been stopped. But when he reached her, she wasn't holding a dead vine. She was holding an old brass key. It was tarnished and green, the head shaped like a four-leaf clover, and it was tangled in the roots of a dead rose bush, right where Sarah used to kneel. "I found a forgotten question, Noah," Lily said, holding the key out on her palm. "It was waiting for the answer you had locked up." Noah took the key. It was heavy and cold in his hand. He recognized it instantly. It was the key to Sarah's small, locked writing desk in the parsonage study, a desk she had forbidden him from opening, saying her thoughts were only for the Lord and her journal. After she died, he hadn't even thought of it. The thought of reading her final, private words felt like a violation of the sacred seal of their life together. He had been paralyzed by his own respect for her privacy and his fear of what he might find. Perhaps a hidden doubt, or worse, a certainty of her departure. Now, seeing the key appear like a gift from the earth itself, he knew he couldn't ignore it. That night, under the lonely glow of the porch light, Noah went to the study. The room felt colder than the rest of the house. The desk was an antique, heavy oak, and the key fit perfectly into the lock. With a quiet click, the sealed portion of Sarah's life was open to him. Inside, there wasn't a final testament or a dramatic farewell. There were only two things: a small, leather-bound journal with only the last few pages written in, and a dried, pressed honeysuckle flower. He picked up the journal first, his heart hammering out a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The last entry was dated 2 days before the accident. The journal entry was not a prayer, nor a prediction. It was a simple, worried observation about him. "Noah hasn't slept through the night in weeks. He's carrying the weight of the whole town's worry on his shoulders, and I see it in the way he scrubs his hands clean, trying to wash off the dust of other people's troubles. I told him today he needs to stop looking at the clouds for a sign and start looking at the ground for a purpose. We don't need a miracle, we need a task. I pray he finds one before he breaks." Reading that, the pressure behind Noah's eyes finally broke. Sarah hadn't been worried about her own soul. She had been worried about his. The theological storm he had invented, God abandoning them, was a distraction from the simple human truth. His wife had seen his stress and wanted him to find a meaningful action to ground him, not a magical solution to save him. The second entry, a short note written on the day she died, was even more mundane, yet piercing. "Picked the first honeysuckle today. I must remember to replant those old, dried seeds from the back of the shed. They deserve one more chance." That was it. No grand farewell, just a tiny chore left undone. And then, he realized the black seed Lily had shown him was the very one Sarah had meant to plant. Noah couldn't sleep. He spent the rest of the night flipping through the rest of the journal. It was filled not with theological debates, but with recipes, notes on how to mend a torn hymnal, and observations about the townspeople. She wrote about Silas's quiet generosity to the poor, about the way the light fell on the altar cloth, and about the time Noah had preached a full sermon with his shirt on backward. It was a record of love for the mundane, a deep, rooted appreciation for the simple, often overlooked workings of life in Harmony Creek. There was no secret plan of God revealed, just the relentless, loving work of a good woman. By dawn, Noah had stopped seeing the journal as a mystery and started seeing it as a map. It pointed not to heaven but to the earth, to the people, and to the small things that needed doing. He went outside, the morning dew, the first hint of moisture in weeks, dampening the porch. Lily was already by the church, but she wasn't in the garden. She was standing by the old, dry baptismal font, a granite bowl outside the sanctuary, now cracked and empty. She was holding a cracked pottery jug, and she slowly poured a few ounces of the water she had carried in her basket, not into the font, but onto the ground beside it. When Noah approached her, Lily spoke before he could ask. Baptisms ain't just for souls, Noah. They're for the land, too. A promise that the cycle ain't finished yet. She gestured to the baptismal font. It's empty because you filled yourself up with the wrong kind of question. You asked, why did she die? You should have been asking, how do I live the life she loved? Noah felt the sharpness of the question cut through the fog of his grief. He looked at the empty font, then at the small, damp patch of earth. Lily knelt down, and using her thumb, she scraped a tiny hollow in the soil next to the font. She took the black seed, the one Sarah had wanted to plant, from her pocket, and gently placed it into the hollow. She covered it with dirt, and then, slowly, she poured the rest of the water from her cracked jug over the patch. It was the simplest, quietest ceremony Noah had ever witnessed. It was an act of faith, yes, but not in a distant God. It was faith in the possibility of a dry seed. This simple act of planting the seed in the dry ground was a powerful symbol, and it wasn't lost on Deacon Silas. He had arrived early for the planned community meeting and saw the whole thing from his truck. Later that morning, the church hall was packed. The air was thick and hot, charged with the nervous energy of people desperate for a sign, a leader, or at least a good thunderstorm. Silas, standing stiffly at the front, started the meeting with a plea for Noah to lead them in a rain prayer. We need the Almighty's intervention, Pastor, Silas said, his voice ringing with authority. We need the old words. But Noah didn't move. He looked at the anxious faces, farmers, shopkeepers, mothers, and saw their fear, but also their quiet human endurance. He stood up, but he didn't go to the pulpit. He stayed on the floor, next to the first row of chairs. He didn't quote scripture. Instead, he told them about Sarah's journal, about the honeysuckle, and about the small black seed. He spoke about the broken downspout and the mold on the church wall, and how fixing it felt more like a response to God than begging for rain. He spoke for 10 minutes, and he never once used the word God or faith. He just talked about work and remembering. The crowd was stunned silent. They had been prepared for a sermon about sin or salvation, and Noah had given them a story about a broken pipe and a dead flower. When he finished, he didn't ask them to pray. He looked at his people, his sheep, and asked a different question. We can't command the clouds, he said, his voice gaining strength. But we can dig. We can fix the things we've let fall apart. Does anyone know where the old cistern is? The one that was covered up 20 years ago? That cistern is still full. It's time we found the hidden water in our own ground. The suggestion was electrifying. The cistern, an old, brick-lined well built by the founders, was indeed rumored to still be full, but the location had been lost, covered by years of overgrowth and old building materials. Suddenly, the people had a task, a focus for their anxiety that was earthly and immediate. Silas, flustered, tried to regain control. That's foolish, Noah. We need spiritual action, not a treasure hunt. But the people were already buzzing, planning, and arguing about where the cistern might be. Noah hadn't given them faith. He had given them hope in their own hands. The search for the cistern became the first common-purpose Harmony Creek had seen since the drought began. Men brought shovels, boys hauled away scrub, and women organized water and lemonade. Noah worked harder than anyone, feeling the slow burn in his shoulders that was a welcome change from the hollow ache in his chest. He worked not as their pastor, but as one of them, a man with a shovel and a task. Lily, meanwhile, continued her strange ministry in the memorial garden. She was now pulling weeds, but she was placing them in a pile, sorting them by type. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the western ridge, painting the sky with fiery streaks, Lily walked up to Noah, who was wiping sweat from his brow. She handed him a piece of paper, folded twice. "The cistern is under the old cedar stump," she said simply. "Silas's grandpappy cut down the tree, but the roots hold the map." He wrote it down. Noah looked at the paper. It was a crude, old drawing, a rough-hewn sketch of the church and a prominent X marked next to the biggest, oldest cedar stump in the back corner of the property. "How do you know this?" Noah demanded, his voice hushed. Lily simply tapped the paper. "The seed remembers the water, Noah, and I just listened to the roots." The next day, they dug under the cedar stump. It was backbreaking work, but the excitement in the small crowd was palpable. After hours of hacking through thick, knotted roots, Ben, the young mechanic, struck something solid with his shovel. It was the top of an old brick archway. They worked carefully, clearing the dirt until the full, moss-covered lid of the cistern was revealed. It was a glorious, profound moment. Noah, using a borrowed crowbar, slowly pried the heavy stone lid open. A rush of cool, damp air escaped, smelling of earth and clean, trapped water. Everyone crowded around the opening, and when Ben lowered a bucket on a rope, it came back up brimming with clear, sweet, life-giving water. It was more than just water. It was proof that their effort, their collective, mundane labor, had been rewarded. They cheered, not with the pious fervor of a revival, but with the raw, relieved sound of farmers who had found a hidden spring. Silas, standing at the edge of the crowd, looked conflicted, his jaw tight. He hadn't prayed for the water, but he couldn't deny its existence. The discovery of the cistern changed the rhythm of Harmony Creek. The people started drawing the cool water first for drinking, then for their wilting gardens. It was a localized, human-made salvation, a small, tangible miracle that their hands had wrought. Noah felt a shift, too. He was still heartbroken, but the despair was overlaid with the grit and dust of useful action. He was alive not through faith but through work. He sought Lily out. He found her in the sanctuary, for the first time. She wasn't praying. She was sitting in the middle aisle, running her fingers along the worn grooves of the floorboards. "The cistern map," Noah said, holding out the old piece of paper. "It was Silas's grandfather." "How did you know?" Lily looked up. Her eyes seemed to hold the dark, cool depth of the cistern water. "Silas's grandpappy buried it when he got sick, afraid the church would use the last of the water for decoration and not for the land. He put the secret in the roots. The key was in the rosebush because Sarah was worried about your dryness, Noah. And the map was in the earth because the earth, like God, remembers all its old promises. I just listened to the places that weren't talking." Lily wasn't an angel or a prophet. She was a listener of the forgotten details. "But what about me?" Noah asked, his voice raw. "I asked why God let Sarah die. Was that the wrong question? The one I couldn't ask the roots?" Lily stood up, walking slowly toward the altar, her bare feet silent on the old wood. "You asked the right question, Noah, but you were listening for an answer written in fire and thunder. The answer was already here. It was written in Sarah's care for the seed, in her worry for your sleep, and in the love for the mundane she wrote in her journal. Dying is simple, Noah. It's living that's complicated. And love is the cistern. It's always there, hidden, even when the surface is dry." She reached the altar, which was draped in a dusty, sun-faded cloth. She gently moved the cloth aside, revealing the old communion chalice. It was dull and tarnished, covered in the green patina of neglect. Your sermon needs to be an action, not just a word. You need to remind them where the real treasure is. The next day was Sunday. The church was packed, not because of a sermon, but because of the cistern. The air was charged with anticipation. People were holding small glass jars filled with the cool, sweet water, like a new kind of holy oil. Deacon Silas was sitting in the front row, his face a careful mask of skepticism and hope. Noah finally walked up the steps to the pulpit. He didn't open the Bible. He just stood there for a long moment, looking at his people. Then, he reached under the pulpit, and he pulled out the old, tarnished communion chalice that Lily had uncovered. It was ugly, dull, and unpolished. He walked down the steps and stood in the middle of the aisle, holding the metal cup. "This cup," he said, his voice rusty but clear, "has been sitting in the dark, forgotten. It's not beautiful. It's not clean. It's just old brass that needs a good polishing." He placed the chalice on a small table, along with a cloth and a bottle of brass polish. "Today, we're not going to pray for a miracle. We're going to perform a chore." Noah didn't preach. He started polishing the cup. The silence in the church was electric. Everyone watched as his big, rough hands worked the polish into the tarnished metal. He worked slowly, deliberately, and as the green grime came off, a deep golden gleam began to emerge. The cup was becoming brilliant, reflecting the light from the dusty windows. As he polished, he started to talk not about doctrine but about life. He spoke about the day Sarah died, about the hollowness that followed, and the lie he told himself, that a loving God wouldn't allow pain. He admitted his failing, his doubt, and his turning away. He talked about the seed, the pipe, the cistern, and the map hidden in the roots. "I thought God was supposed to fix the drought," he confessed, looking up, his face streaked with sweat and brass polish. "But all God asked me to do was fix the things I broke and listen to the things I ignored." God is in the polishing, folks. God is in the hard, honest work of restoring what's already here. The effect of his honest, broken speech was profound. It wasn't a sermon. It was a confession of labor. When he finished, the chalice was shining, a beacon of gold in the dim church. He didn't put it back on the altar. He picked it up and walked to the front door of the church. He then walked outside and headed straight for the cistern. The congregation, mesmerized, followed him. At the cistern, he filled the sparkling, newly polished chalice with the cool, sweet water they had found. He walked back, passing through the quiet crowd. He set the cup on the altar, brimming with the water of their own finding. "This is the gift," he said, "the hidden water, the love that was already here. Take what you need, but leave some for the soil." Deacon Silas was the first to move. He walked slowly to the altar, picked up a small ladle, and dipped it into the chalice. He didn't drink. He walked back to his seat and used his thumb to wipe a small amount of the water onto the brittle, dry palm of his hand. His face, usually so stern, was crumpled with emotion. Other people followed, taking sips, or wetting their lips, or simply touching the cool water. The church service had become a quiet, spontaneous, communal act of re-engagement with the earth and with each other. They didn't need grand theology. They needed to touch the fruit of their own honest labor. Noah watched, feeling lighter than he had in months. He had preached the truth of his despair, and in doing so, he had created room for their collective hope. He looked for Lily. She wasn't at the altar or in the crowd. She was standing at the edge of the memorial garden, which, surprisingly, now showed the first faint green shoots struggling up through the soil where she had planted Sarah's seed. The water from the cistern was already finding its way to the roots. She looked at Noah and gave him a faint, knowing smile that didn't need words. It was a smile of a job completed, a debt repaid, a silent lesson learned. He started walking towards her, needing to thank her, needing to ask her one final simple question. What was her real name, and where had she come from? He walked past the last row of pews, across the small bit of carpet, and stepped onto the dirt path. When he looked up, she was gone. She hadn't run, or faded, or floated away. She was simply no longer there. He searched the grounds, the parsonage, even the dusty, cracked road leading out of Harmony Creek. Nothing. No footsteps. No sign of her linen dress. No trace of the woven basket. Lily had vanished as quietly and mysteriously as she had arrived. It was as if she had been a part of the drought, a necessary catalyst to remind the people and their pastor where to find the water they needed. Noah stood by the greening patch of soil, where the first leaves of Sarah's forgotten seed were unfurling, and he understood. He didn't need to know her name or her origin. She wasn't a miracle. She was the memory keeper, the spirit of necessary action. She had given him back his life not by restoring his old faith, but by showing him that work is the true worship. The preaching he had to do now wasn't about the distant kingdom of God, but about the very real, hard-won kingdom of Harmony Creek. Noah returned to the pulpit the next Sunday, but he didn't preach the old way. He spoke about the cistern, about the broken pipe, and about the newly polished chalice that now sat on the altar, forever filled with the water of their own finding. He spoke about the tiny green shoots in the memorial garden and how every morning he went out to check on them, a small act of devotion. He told them that hope was not a thing to be waited for, but a thing to be done. And the people listened, not with bowed heads, but with lifted eyes and open hands, ready to get to work. And they did work. They fixed the church roof, mended the fence, and even started a town-wide project to rebuild the old irrigation ditch that ran from the river. Noah wasn't just their pastor. He was their foreman, their neighbor, and the man who remembered. The drought eventually broke, not with a sudden deluge, but with a slow, steady rain that soaked deep into the thirsty soil. The rain fell on the church, ran down the newly fixed downspout, and soaked the garden, ensuring the survival of Sarah's small, black seed. The church was full, not just on Sundays, but on Tuesdays, when they met to discuss the town's needs, and on Thursdays, when they shared a communal meal made with the first crops of the newly watered land. Noah never stopped looking for Lily, not really. He looked for her in every small, necessary detail that had been forgotten. The loose hinge, the cracked pane of glass, the thirsty root. He knew, deep in his bones, that she wasn't some grand, supernatural being, but the simple, clear voice of the unaddressed task. The end of the drought brought with it a different kind of challenge. Rebuilding. The long silence had left deep cracks, and not just in the ground. Harmony Creek needed more than just water. It needed a purpose that went beyond survival. Noah, now fully engaged in the work, realized his role had shifted entirely. He no longer saw himself as the man who delivered God's answers. He was the man who helped the community ask the right questions. He organized work parties, mediated arguments over water rights, and instituted a common care fund, which was simply the church collection plate used to buy seeds and tools for the poorest farmers. He even learned how to weld, using the heat of the torch to join broken metal, much like he was trying to join the broken pieces of his life. Deacon Silas, seeing the practical good being done, slowly came around, his disapproval melting into a grudging respect. He still wished for more scripture, but he couldn't deny the abundance created by the hands of his congregation. Silas started bringing his own toolbox to church meetings, quietly contributing his organizational skills to the community projects. Noah learned that forgiveness and belief didn't come through the lightning strike of conversion, but through the patient, shared burden of doing good things together. The small, black seed that Lily planted grew into a magnificent, deep purple flower, something no one in Harmony Creek had ever seen before. It wasn't a honeysuckle or a rose, but something strange and utterly beautiful, a testament to the life that can spring from the driest places. Noah never named the flower. He just called it Sarah's bloom. People would walk to the memorial garden just to look at it, a quiet symbol of hope and resurrection that didn't require a preacher or a sermon to explain. This flower became the new heart of the church's story, replacing the tale of Noah's despair with the memory of Sarah's wisdom. Noah realized that Lily hadn't just brought him back to his faith. She had brought him to a better faith, one that was humble, dirty, and focused on the immediate, tangible needs of his neighbors. He stopped wearing his clerical collar and started wearing overalls, only putting on a clean shirt for Sunday service. He found peace not in the grand promises of heaven, but in the certainty of the soil under his fingernails and the clear, cool taste of the cistern water. He learned to speak differently, too. His sermons were short now, often only 10 minutes long. They were observations, really, about the way a newly fixed hinge could hold a heavy door, or how the oldest brick in the foundation still carried the most weight. He took his lessons from the mundane, proving that the sacred was not separated from the ordinary, but entirely contained within it. He didn't promise them an easy path to glory. He promised them a hard, good day's work and the satisfaction of seeing something broken become whole again. He realized that Lily's purpose was to simply remind him of the lesson Sarah had already taught him. To look down at the ground for a purpose, not up at the sky for a sign. The absence of Sarah was still a deep scar, but it was no longer a wound that paralyzed him. It was a space that allowed new growth. Years passed, turning the dust of the drought into the rich topsoil of a thriving community. The church became a true center of the town, less a place of abstract worship and more a common house of labor and care. The cistern never ran dry. Noah, his hair now streaked with honest silver, had found a quiet contentment. He still sat on the porch swing, but now the squeak of the chain sounded less like an ache and more like a gentle rhythm. One afternoon, a young man from the next town over, a traveling salesman of farm equipment, stopped by. He looked at the lush memorial garden, admired the strange purple bloom, and then looked at the old granite steps. "Pastor," the young man said, pointing to the tiny gray river stone placed over the crack. "What's that little stone doing there? Seems like a strange place to leave a rock." Noah smiled, a slow, gentle curve of the lips that held the weight of a long journey. He walked down the steps and picked up the stone. He held it in his palm, feeling the cool, smooth texture. "That, son," Noah said, handing the stone to the young man, "is a memory. It's a marker for a beginning that looked exactly like an ending. It reminds us that when things are cracked, you don't wait for a miracle to weld them shut. You just find something steady and solid to hold the edges together until the roots can do the rest of the work." The young man looked confused, but accepted the stone, tucking it into his pocket. Noah watched him drive away, then turned back towards the church. He looked at the flourishing garden, the sturdy building, and the reflection of the setting sun glinting off the polished brass chalice inside. He knew Lily had not been an angel, a myth, or a ghost, but simply a human being willing to see what was there. His preaching had stopped when he lost his faith, but it only truly began again when he found his purpose, right there in the dry, forgotten earth of Harmony Creek. And that, I reckon, is the only kind of faith that'll ever truly save a man.